And as a mom, I started off as a very anxious and timid mom. I felt like a fraud and a failure as a pediatric nurse practitioner, coaching people on how to handle their families when I felt like me and my oldest daughter, when she arrived at those teen years, we were fighting all the time. And in fact, the opening scene of Behind Closed Doors, my book, is that moment of crisis where we were driving down the road. She was in the back seat and she threw a book at my head. I mean, we're talking a 4-volume book.
Welcome to Pass It On with Amy Warren, a podcast where we bring teens, parents, grandparents, and Christian leaders and thinkers to the table to discuss hard questions, find common ground, and pass on the historic Christian faith. Today, we are delving into the raging waters of teens and mental health. How can parents and teens work together to successfully navigate this important topic? How can Christian parents find healthcare workers that they can trust? What are warning signs we can look for and practical things parents and teens can do to foster good mental health? And how can the local church make positive contributions towards these efforts? Our guest today is Dr. Jessica Peck. Let's meet her and learn a little bit more about her. All right, well, welcome our guest, Dr. Jessica Peck, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Peck is a pediatric nurse practitioner, as well as a professor, author, and mother of 4. Native Texan, she has a Doctor of Nursing practice degree and is a clinical professor at the Baylor University Louise Harrington School of Nursing. She recently completed her term as president of the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners. You can connect with Dr. Peck through her website or find her on social media and through her Dr. Nurse Mama podcast. Dr. Peck, thank you for being here today and welcome.
Hey, Amy, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to just tell our listeners a little bit about how we met. We met at the Marriage Family Life Conference, which is hosted by American Family Radio. Dr. Peck came and did a session on teens and mental health for our teen track, ages 13 to 17. And I've got to tell you, it was one of our kids' favorites. It was such practical information. It hit really close to the heart, to their minds, to the experiences that they're dealing with right now. And so I just wanted to bring Dr. Peck on and share some of her insight and expertise and just her heart and her passion, because it really just encompasses all of it. It's the mental health, it's the spiritual health, it's the physical health. And I think you called it the holistic view of health. And we so appreciate that. And so Dr. Peck, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family, your profession, what you do, and why you have such a heart for teens.
Sure. Well, I'm a mom of 2 teenage girls and 2 teenage boys. So I have to give my oldest daughter credit because she did just turn 20. So she's still at that age where, birthdays are great and they don't mind getting older. I told her, enjoy that while it lasts. But I've got 4 young people that are my own kids. So I know what that's like. And in my journey, starting out, I was the first woman in my family to go to college. I went to community college as a nursing student. I was a very timid, honestly, pretty awful student because I was working 3 jobs to pay my way through school. And so I never imagined that God would lead a path for me to become a nurse practitioner and have a doctoral degree and be a professor. But that's just been the journey that God has blessed me with. And as a woman, I started off in a family with broken family relationships. It wasn't until I went to my master's degree program, we had to make something called a genogram, which is like a family tree where we trace diseases that they have. And I realized then that addiction was a generational trauma that we had that just wound its way through our family tree like a strangling vine. And I had never seen it like that. And it doesn't matter. I learned that if you remove that offending substance or the addictive substance, you learn as a generation those patterns of behavior that are harmful. And so we were experiencing that. So I had broken family relationships. And as a mom, I started off as a very anxious and timid mom. I felt like a fraud and a failure as a pediatric nurse practitioner, coaching people on how to handle their families when I felt like me and my oldest daughter, when she arrived at those teen years, we were fighting all the time. And in fact, the opening scene of Behind Closed Doors, my book, is that moment of crisis where we were driving down the road. She was in the back seat and she threw a book at my head. I mean, we're talking a 4-volume book. And that was a pivotal moment where I knew I needed a new mindset and a new skill set. And that's just the journey that God has had me on. And I see my own kids now, I've been on my own healing journey that has helped them, but even having all of the resources, my kids still struggle. And so I really wanted to bring that mindset to parents. That's how Dr. Nurse Mama was born, which is my podcast, my professor brain, my hands-on nursing experience, but most of all, my heart as a mom to be a guide on the side for parents who are in the trenches and doing all the things.
Absolutely, that's great. Now, I'll just jump right into this because I'm so intrigued by your because you have over 2 decades of experience and work with young people. What changes have you observed in the area of mental health in those 2 decades?
Oh my goodness. If I was on every podcast in the world, I would not have enough time to talk about how much pediatrics has changed. I look back at my practice at 20, 25 years ago, and I don't even recognize it. I mean, it is completely changed. Every single day when I show up to clinic, I'm going to see kids struggling with depression, anxiety, suicide, gender identity confusion, sexting or engaging in other risky behaviors online. I mean, it's just not even close to the same what we have. And what we know is that the internet and smartphone, living at the speed of a smartphone, has really changed the trajectory of life for Gen Z. And they are encountering things that we in previous generations can't anticipate. So that's a really hard thing because as parents, when we're teaching our kids to drive, we know how to drive. We've done that. We can tell them exactly what to look out for. We have no idea what's coming around the bend on a smartphone, and we can't anticipate that, and it scares us. And sometimes as parents, we just kind of think, oh, I don't really want to think about that, or I don't want to expose my kids to things they haven't been exposed to. But we have to intentionally expose them in a developmentally appropriate way that positions us as the experts so that we can guide them through these things before they come and prevent great harm. This is the first generation in which parents are replaceable. If kids don't like what you're saying, they can find an online echo chamber. If you cut off their allowance, they can sell something online. So easy. If they say, if they don't like staying in your house, even, they can put out a message on social media or text message and say, where can I couch surf or couch crash? And they'll have a welcome invitation in less than a minute. But the encouraging part of this is, although culture and society is fighting for the mind of your child, nobody's fighting for their heart. That is up for grabs. And that's something where we have to come alongside and pursue the hearts of our teens to build healthy relationships.
That's so good. That's so good. I'm gonna bring it into the extreme for just a moment, but I promise our listeners that we're going. There is hope.
Yeah,
There is hope. But I
there
want to get
is.
your take on this. Dr. Matthew Sleeth, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, probably have, but he is a former emergency room physician. And he wrote a book called Hope Always. And in it, he outlined the epidemic that we are facing in our country concerning loneliness and depression. And he writes that the suicide rate during the Great Depression was approximately 14 per 100,000. He says today, with the adjustments for technological advancements, we are looking at about 300 per 100,000. And he says, and I quote, he says, as a country, we are in the midst of the greatest spiritual depression we have ever known. Now, when you look at that, you look at numbers like 50% of marriages ending in divorce. You look at 67% of second marriages and 73, I think, percent of third marriages. What is the connection here between the spiritual condition of our homes and mental health?
Oh, there is such a connection because we are holistic beings. God made us that way. We are spiritual. We have our physical bodies, but we have our mental health. There's emotional health. There is our spiritual health. And all of those things are connected. And so much of what I see is a generation of parents, we are guilty of being in that instant gratification, where we want instant gratification of everything. I mean, I can go on an app and in a moment order a coffee exactly like I wanted and then walk up and have that coffee exactly tailor made for me. And we want to do that with our kids. We have no tolerance for long term problems. We want to be like a virtual assistant online where our kids come to us and we say, "Oh, thank you for asking me about that problem. Here is the advice you should try." And then they want it to be better. Can I help you with anything else? And the truth is, this is really, really hard, Amy, but the truth is, we try to manipulate our kids' behavior because that gives us an instant feedback loop that we're doing a good job as a parent. And so we start to care only about how things look on social media, and we forget to care about what's really going on in their heart. And so much of what we do is our faith. It's caught, it's not taught. And so we're trying to do all these spiritual disciplines. We feel better if our kids are in church, if they're reading their Bibles, if they're praying at night before bed. But we really have to put in the blood, sweat, and tears. There is no easy way around it. And we treat our kids like they're chia pets. We just want to put in a little bit of effort and by tomorrow have a plant that looks great. But it's really like growing a pineapple, which takes an average of 2 years to grow. And it's constant that you're watering, you're putting it in the sun, and you see nothing. You see no growth. But as parents, we have to have confidence that planting and harvesting don't happen in the same season. And our kids need to see the confidence in our eyes because they feel like everything is overwhelming. And one of the reasons we're seeing the suicide epidemic is because kids are more afraid of life than they are afraid of death. And they need to see the confidence in us that, hey, you're struggling with something right now, but I know that you will overcome this and that I will walk through this with you and that there are better days ahead.
That's so good. When you were talking, I was reminded of a time when my girls were younger, and I was just so frustrated. And my husband, he's so wise. He's a pastor, and he's been a student of the scripture since he was 15 years old. Where he said, remember that it is the Holy Spirit's job to convict. You can't be there with them the whole time. It is the Holy Spirit's job to convict them and to correct them and to guide them. And so for us as parents, it is our job to model that. What does it look like when we're frustrated? Are we listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit? Are we being guided in those times of passion and anger and frustration? Because those moments are going to be modeled for them, and that's what they're going to see. So good.
My husband is not a pastor, but he's a rocket scientist who's amused at the perception that I'm the smart one in the relationship. But
Lots of
it's
brains in that house. That's great.
exactly, but he has so much wisdom too, and there's so much wisdom in having both of us, and he's an engineer. So he will tell my kids, I'm going to hurt your feelings. It's inevitable, but your mom will help you with that, which is so true. But I couldn't agree more with what you said. It is the Holy Spirit's job because I hear a lot about gatekeeping as a parenting style and making sure that,
Yeah.
we keep every negative influence out of our kids' lives. And my concern with that is that that is a defensive strategy, which we need. We
Mm.
need a good defense. But what is missing, in my view, Amy, today is an offensive strategy. We have to go after the hearts of our teens, and we are not going to be there at every juncture where they make decisions. And smartphones and social media just accelerates that decision making process and it amplifies it. So if they make a poor decision, it's amplified on social media if that's an element that's involved. So we have to teach them how to listen to the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And how do we best teach them that? by modeling that in our own lives. So speaking that out loud when you're having that decision making process. I mean, even me as a 40 something year old woman, I mean, I have moments in my life where I think, should I go to this event? Is this a person to follow, or a book to read, or a movie to watch? And so I'm really cognizant about walking that out loud and saying, all right, let me think about, is this true? Is this noble? Is this praiseworthy? Is this something that I should dwell on? And so just bringing that in is so important.
I love how you said that we need there's not many people going after their heart. And I realize this in working with teens as long as I have in the church environment and raising my kids. And I was the one saying, oh, these safe spaces and these, coloring page things and these painting times and these, puppy petting times are ridiculous. This is ridiculous. You need to suck it up. You need to do what you've got to do. Accomplish what you have to accomplish. This is ridiculous. I realized something in studying culture, in realizing the things that Gen Z is dealing with that we never saw, we never understood. They are looking at an ocean of competing ideas of what is true. The world does not shut up for them. The world is always loud, always loud. And so I realized when my daughter went to college and she was telling me about these little paint things and puppy things, and I was going, whoa, she needs that. Like, they need that. They need those things. They're not as ridiculous as I thought they were. They need those times where it's quiet and it's just something where their mind can just kind of cruise, right? Be put on cruise control. But the other thing I notice about that is, man, our homes need to be those safe spaces.
Mm. Yeah.
Don't they? Our homes are supposed to be those safe spaces where they come and they can shut out the world. And what are we doing as parents to make sure that the world is not infiltrating our homes?
Oh my gosh, that is such good conversation here. And I feel really strongly about this, and I even talked about it at the conference where I was at, is that, we look at Gen Z and there's a lot of talk about their snowflakes, they're weak, they need to suck it up. But I think there's an element to Gen Z that is much tougher and braver than any generation before, because we have World War II veterans, the greatest generation, who were so stoic and they stuffed everything down. And so that gave birth to the silent generation, seen and not heard. And then we have baby boomers who saw war that made their grandparents and parents emotionally inaccessible. And so they protested that and just went on a search for love for themselves. And that gave Gen X, who are the latchkey kids who overcompensated with millennials who love their parents but don't leave them. But Gen Z is the first generation that's actually said it out loud, like that, hey, this hurts and we want to deal with this in a healthy way. And so some of those elements of self care, like coloring or just slowing down and taking a moment to shut out the noise of the world and not live at a speed of a smartphone, is so important. Because for us, the world was so small. The world looked like our neighborhood. Now, all the world's bad news is delivered to them in an instant. And if they see one video of a school shooting, the social media algorithm's going to feed them every video of everything. So until all of a sudden they think, this is what the world looks like, I should be deathly afraid of a school shooting to happen every day. When the truth is that even though it's a horrible, horrible thing, it's not common. It's not, they're more likely to not have that happen than to happen. And so you're absolutely right. Our homes need to be a safe space for them. They need to feel like they can come in, they can be transparent, they can be authentic, that they are accepted for who they are. And one of the really important things that I think is helpful to parents in doing this is, sometimes when kids are in our home and they're having a behavioral struggle, they're struggling with messiness or a bad attitude or disrespect or not being on time. As parents, sometimes we generalize that into a character struggle, and we use shame based parenting instead of grace based parenting. So, some clues that you could listen for in your conversation would be, why are you always so fill in the blank? Why do you always have to fill in the blank? Like, why can't you just, instead of, hey, I see you're struggling with this. How can I support you to help get past this? And just recognizing that you're a really good kid who's having a really specific struggle. Another thing that I do to make my home a safe space is try to create physical environments where they feel welcome and hang out in those spaces. So I try to be available, like in my office. I have a chair next to my office. It's next to my desk. It's always open. Sometimes they'll just come and sit there and not say anything. Sometimes they'll work on homework, or sometimes they'll come and talk, and they start calling it the counseling chair. But it's just an open invitation that, hey, I know I'm working because I work from home, but this chair is always open for you. And in my kitchen, I have a bar stool that's there so that they can come and sit while I'm cooking. Or, well, okay, the honest truth is that doesn't happen very much because I'm not the cook. My husband's Italian. So my kids are always like, please don't cook, mom. So if I'm making a box of macaroni and cheese or a peanut butter jelly sandwich, they can come and sit next to me and do that. But I think it's really important for us to cultivate physical and emotional spaces where we're communicating to our kids, hey, you're welcome. You're welcome into my life. You're welcome to have conversation. That door is open at any time.
That is so good. And I'll add to that a little bit just because of, as a youth worker, I try to do that for all of the teens in my church. My home is open and they know I feed them because, that's what we do. And so when they come, there's always something to eat. There's always a couch for them to sit on. There's always an opportunity for them to talk. And so, man, yeah, foster that in your home. But can you give us a better picture of the what the Gen Z went through after COVID?
Mm,
Because I know you
yeah.
during your session, you really sort of gave an excellent just overview of the things that Gen Z went through that our generations really never went through.
Yes, this was such a shift in perspective for me. And on the first day of quarantine, I was, at home with the rest of the world, wondering what in the world was going to happen. And I went out in my backyard and I had a rare moment of quiet. The world just seemed quiet at that moment. And when everybody was afraid, and I had my journal and my Bible, and I feel like God just gave me a vision of the horizon. I knew the things that were behind us and how they were impacting teen health, but to see what was coming, the emotional and social and moral injury that was going to happen as a result of shutting the world down, it really took my breath away. And so we talked about, generational differences just a few minutes ago, but you look at those sentinel pivotal moments in the generation. If you were a World War II, if you're greatest generation, you know where you were, your parents or grandparents on VE Day. You know where you were if you're a baby boomer when JFK was shot. You know if you're a Gen Xer where you were when the Challenger exploded. You know if you were a millennial where you were on 9/11. This generation is going to talk about that moment. Where were you when the world shut down? When the world closed on the day of quarantine? Where were you and what did that look like for you? Now, the difference here's the mind shift that happened here. All of those events before, they evoked a sense of patriotism, a sense of unity, a sense of, hey, we are going to get through this together. I know on 9/11, we didn't even have the internet then, but my husband and I just went to our church in the middle of the day because we didn't know where else to go. And guess what? Everybody else was there. COVID tore the world apart. It caused deep divisions over racial divides, over social justice, over science was politicized. I mean, everything was divided, and they saw this tear the world apart. And that's what they're trying to pick up the pieces of and go on together in in an event that has deeply polarized conversations. They're seeing this happen at their kitchen tables, at family gatherings. They're seeing the arguments, and guess what they're thinking? I don't want any part of that. And so, what we're doing as parents is we're taking our political lens and political argument and the way that we talk with our friends and peers, and we're trying to take that conversation to our kids, and they don't want to hear it. So, we have to have, there's a time and a place for that, for all of that conversation. But that's not what's going to work in your home. You have to go for their heart. And the only way that you can do that is by building relationships. And what we know about kids experiencing trauma is the number one predictor of resilience, of them recovering from that trauma, is a healthy relationship with an adult in their life. So we underestimate the value of what we provide in simply having a relationship. We can't fix all their problems, but we can walk alongside them and cultivate healthy spiritual, emotional, physical health and resilience.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. One thing that I know that when in talking with teens is part of that relationship, part of that discussion, part of that spending time with them is helping them to have a biblical worldview, because understanding that the world, that there is a greater story, right? That what the cultural moment that we're living in is not the grand story. The grand story includes, involves a God who created the world and made all things good, that sin, the rebellion of sin caused all these things to be broken. And the relationship with ourselves and our mental health is one of those relationships that were broken in the fall. But then there's redemption, right? There's redemption in Christ. And Christ came to fix all of those relationships. And then there is going to be one day restoration where he comes back and he makes all things new. And I think part of in discussing, and I'm no mental health expert by any means, but in discussing with these teenagers, a lot of times I realize just helping them to see the grand story, just pulling them into an understanding of the grand story many times helps them sort of get a perspective on the cultural moment. Now it's a little harder with a teenager, right? Because right now is your whole world. When you're a teenager, it's like there was no yesterday, there's no tomorrow. This is right now, and this is all that matters. But giving them and grounding them in the grand story of the biblical worldview, I think, in my experience, has helped a little bit with that. So you talk about social media, and what can parents do to keep their teens safe on social media?
Oh, that is such a hard thing. So I think as parents, we can collectively agree that we are tired of being the screen time police and the phone police, and it's always limited on, you can't do this. You can only have this much time. You can't have these apps. You can't have this function on your smartphone. Like, let me see it. Let me take it away. You're grounded from it. We need to flip the paradigm. And really, the first thing that I would tell parents is to try to create compelling alternatives that make them want to get off their phone. So often when we see unhealthy phone use in our teens that irritates us, the truth is, if we flip the mirror on ourselves, we're going to see those behaviors in ourselves. So I remember, when I was in practice one day and I had this little boy, like school age boy, come in, and his mom had taken away his gaming system, and he actually physically assaulted her and was admitted to a mental health facility. And I'm talking to my teens pretty sanctimoniously about this. And my son listened and he said, "But Mom, Facebook is just Fortnite for adults." And I thought, ouch, we justify our phone use, right? Like, oh, this is work, or I'm talking to grandma, or I'm posting something about our family thing. And that is a phenomenon called phubbing, phubbing, phubbing our kids, phone snubbing. And the way that God designed us is when we look at our children and make eye contact for 20 seconds or more, it actually makes their brain secrete oxytocin, which is the same chemical you would have as a mother nursing a baby. And it makes them feel bonded to us. And when we're listening with our face in our phone, they don't have that, and they feel disrespected and disconnected. So that's the first thing that I would say is look at your own social media use. Do you have tech-free times and tech-free zones that they will model? Because the truth is, we are the biggest influence as parents in our teens' lives. It's not their friends. It is just not. That is a myth in popular culture. It is us. The other things that I would say, just very briefly, that the three things that you could do really to help with your kids' social media use is, first of all, don't let them use social media until they're at least 13. Don't even have a conversation with it about that before that, because that's the minimum age set by federal law in the Children's Online Privacy Act. Clicking that box shows them it's okay to lie and it's okay to violate the terms of use. And then what I've seen is kids experience bad outcomes, bullies or predators, and then they have no legal protection because they violated the terms of use. So that's the first thing. If they do have social media, and in my book, Behind Closed Doors, chapter 2 is all about that. And there's a big, long checklist that you can go through to see, is my child ready for social media? Once they get on it, make sure that their account is private. That is a non-negotiable for me and my kids, because there are all kinds of bad things that can happen from meeting people that you don't know or giving people open access to the information in your life. And the third thing that they should do is actually remove geotagging from their photos. When you take a photo on an iPhone, it takes a latitude, a longitude, and an altitude. And anybody can pull that metadata from the photo that's pulled, and they can start to follow your teen. So those are just some basic safety tips that will help keep your teen safe online. But the truth is that healthy social media use is going to come from us adopting it and providing compelling alternatives, like game night, or kids really do want to step into life with us, but we just have to make ourselves available and make sure they know they're welcome to come.
That's great. That's great advice. I remember when my teenager, she was about 16, 17 years old, and we had, talked extensively about social media ever since they were young. I didn't let them get on any social media at all. And around 16 years old, she asked about a particular app, and I said, "Let's look at it. Let's look at it together. Let's talk about it. Let's look and see what's on it." And she concluded on herself that she wasn't ready for it. And so I was very, very proud of her. Very
My
proud
daughter
of her.
had
But
the
I agree.
same she had the same, when she was in 5th grade, she wanted Instagram. This was when Instagram was new, and she said, "Every kid in my class has Instagram." And I said, "What every parent knows to say, every kid in your class does not have Instagram." But sure enough, they did. And so I reverted to parenting line number 2, like, well, if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you do that? But as a professor mom, I gave her an assignment, and she did a paper. And at the end of the paper, she said, "I'm not ready for this." And so that's really good. Instead of just, old school parenting on my way or the highway, it just doesn't work because they have other sources of information. So we really need to invite that and them into that decision making process and help them find that information along the way.
Yeah, I agree. And part of that too in the parenting and in helping them to have a Christian worldview is just constantly bringing them back to the purpose of things, the purpose of humanity, the purpose of technology, the purpose of all things that God created. What is the purpose? The purpose is to bring him glory. And if these things are causing destruction, causing, a negative view of yourself or of others or things like that, bringing them back, constantly pulling them back to that biblical worldview, I think helps them as well. So, what are some positive uses that parents can encourage their teens toward concerning social media? Because there has to be some, right? Social media is
There
not going
are.
anywhere. We can't
Yes.
get rid of it.
Exactly. It's here to stay. It's a reality of modern living. It is here to stay. And so the movement is called pro-social behaviors, to have healthy behaviors and learn how to do those. So there are some benefits of social media. And actually, it's really interesting for me as a professor when I look at the research on kids who use social media. The kids who don't have any social media at all, they're banned from it. They tend to be miserable in the study findings, like say, like, I'm kind of miserable. The kids that use it all the time, way too much, they're constantly on it, they're even more miserable. They have anxiety, they have depression, they have increased risk for suicide and risk-taking behaviors. But the kids that have the happiest scores, on overall emotional health, are those kids who have learned to master healthy use. And so again, I think that, just learning some of those boundaries is really important. But it's great to connect with friends. You can start your own side hustle. You can start a lawn business, or I see a lot of Gen Z who have entrepreneurial opportunities that are fantastic that happen through social media. There's ways to learn about the world, and there's even ways to influence in a positive way your micro influence your peers. So you can constantly, if you're posting, "Hey, I'm checking in at church," and, "Hey, I found this Bible verse that's really helpful to me today," and you're just living that authentically, that's going to be helpful. But it's really interesting to see Gen Z, because they're trending back more towards privacy. Millennials don't, they are not about privacy. They post every bite they eat, right? Everything, like, that's just their culture. But Gen Z, you see that close friends circle on Instagram feature where they can say, "Hey, I just want to use, these friends," or even the rise of Be Real, which is literally being real, no filters. No, it tells if you have a retake, and it's just, "Hey, what are you doing in this moment?" Which tells me that Gen Z is longing for authentic, meaningful, transparent relationships. And that's the sweet spot for parents. That's where we can go in and be that person and pursue their heart.
Okay. So, what are warning signs? Tell us
Mm.
about warning signs that we can look at when we have teenagers that are having difficulty socially, emotionally, spiritually. What are warning signs that we want to pay attention to as parents?
I'm so glad you asked this because I see, like I told you at the beginning of this program, I see kids every day in my clinic who are engaged in sexting, who are engaged in pornography, who are engaged in all kinds of risk taking behaviors. When I'm looking at my clinic schedule for the day, it does not say on the appointment note, is sexting and feeling depressed. Like it doesn't say that. It says they have a headache, they're not eating. And the truth is, when the parents come in, we have that innate spidey sense as parents that something is not quite right. Their eating patterns are off. Their sleeping patterns are off. They're just don't seem themselves. Maybe they're dressing a little bit differently. They're a little more secretive. They seem sad. And what happens when we see those things is that we give in to stigma that society puts on those. And we think, oh, something's wrong, but what should I do about it? Now, flip the narrative. And if your kid came home from school and they had a little low grade temperature and they said, my throat's a little sore, you probably would pick up the phone and schedule an appointment to have them swabbed for strep because you just want to make sure that everything's okay. Or if they're waking up in the night, remember when they're babies and they're fussy and pulling on their ear, you think, well, it's not that bad, but let me just go check it out. We don't do that with mental health. And we think, let's just wait it out. Like, oh, let me lecture. Like, let me, tell them, hey, you better get your act together. Let's change the diet or try some vitamin supplements. Or you have an argument even with your husband about how to handle it. And by the time they come in to see me, it is way down the road. So, what I would encourage parents to say is that you know your kids and you know when something is off. And when you start to have that internal dialogue that says, hey, something's wrong, it's a great time to go to your primary care provider and just say, hey, something just seems off here. Can you just check everything? We'll check everything. We'll listen to their heart, check their blood sugar, or whatever is needed, and then do some behavior rating scales where we'll say, yeah, there's some depression going on here. Let's investigate that. And that's why it's important. I get a lot of pushback then because parents don't they say, oh no, I don't want them to offer me medicine or I don't trust my healthcare provider. You need to find one that you like and that you trust. That is a critical partner for you to have. And it may take you a while. It may take you a few visits. It may take you an interview, but you need to have that resource in your life to partner with you as an expert in your child, us as an expert in healthcare, and to be able to come up together with the plan that's best for your family.
That's such great advice because I know when my daughter went off to college, she went to a Christian university. And one of the first things that they told us about was they had some mental health professionals there that were available. They had counseling, and then they, took it up a step. They had, I think it was life coaching, and then a step up from there to counseling. You correct me if I'm wrong, and then a step up from there to psychology. Is that about the right? And so they had them
Yes.
all available for the students, which I thought was wonderful. It was wonderful. And it helps sort of take away the stigmas, like you said, that this generation does not see that much of a stigma as our generation did when it comes to mental health and seeking help. Now, as Christians, right, we look at the world, we look at the health profession, just the turn that it's taking towards an atheistic worldview that even is militant against Christianity and a Christian worldview. How can parents find health professionals that share their concerns when it comes to seeking holistic health for their teens? Because you don't want your kids to wind up in an office of someone who's trying to tell them that they need to change their gender. Now, this is a big concern for a lot of parents right now, and the kind of the thought process.
Sure. And really like, whoa, Pandora's box right there, Amy. Right? Like this is something we could talk about for a really long time. But if I can just, talk about it just in a nutshell and summarize it, is that, I think it's unfortunate that there's a perception that most pediatric care providers are like, we're showing up at the door with a scalpel ready to do gender affirming surgery or, medication, because that's not the norm. for how most pediatric healthcare providers are practicing. And it's real. And pediatric healthcare providers, the way that we're trained is to partner with the family and to recognize and respect their expertise. And any pediatric healthcare provider should be trying to connect the teens with their parents. So for me, when I talk to teens by themselves, a lot of times I get parents who get really defensive about that. And so I'm very open and willing to be transparent about this is what I'm talking about. And that's one of the main goals that I had in my book Behind Closed Doors was to destigmatize those talks. But the truth is, when we talk to kids, a lot of times they disclose things to us they have not disclosed to their parents. And it's not because they're keeping secrets or they're trying to do things behind your back. It's because they care so much about what you think. And then they've messed up and they can't find a way to come to you and tell you, hey, I've messed up, because maybe there's never even been a conversation about that. Maybe the only conversation about sex is, hey, it's bad, don't do it till you're married, and then it's great. And then they, cross boundaries and they don't know where to go. They don't know me, so they don't really care about my opinion of them, but they know that I may have some resources. Well, my job is to connect them back and to facilitate conversation. Now, the reality is not every kid is blessed to have a parent who cares about them and who loves them and who is committed to helping them. And so that's a reality that we have to face. But what I would say to parents is don't be afraid to call an office and say, I would like to schedule an interview either on the phone or in person to interview this healthcare provider. Anyone that's worth their salt is going to say, yeah, they're going to have times where they have new parent interviews and they do that. Now, you may have to wait a little bit for that, but go in with your questions and don't be afraid, because we're already talking about very intimate, uncomfortable things. I mean, we're healthcare, so we do all the things. There's nothing that's off limits. So ask those questions that are necessary to help you make a judgment. Is this the right healthcare provider for my child? That's really important.
That's really helpful. That is really, really helpful, because there are extremes and we've seen them all over the news. But, then you have parents who are just so afraid. They're afraid to bring their kids to any medical office anywhere
Mm-hmm.
because of the stories, because of the extremes that you hear in the media and things like that. And so thank you for clarifying that up. You mentioned in your book, and we're going to talk a little bit about your book here, if we're going to sort of shift here. You mentioned in your book that there are 5 types of anxiety disorders. Can you define those for us?
Sure. So, when we're looking at this, is a really important distinction I want to say first is that when we're talking about mental health, there are symptoms of anxiety and symptoms of depression that may not result in a diagnosis. It's all on a continuum. So, we have this specific criteria. So, for example, to get a specific diagnosis of anxiety, those symptoms are going to have to have persisted for, greater than a certain length of time and impacted your activities of living more than so many times a week. And so we're looking at, not everybody who comes in and says, oh, you've got symptoms of anxiety, we're going to say, oh, you have a diagnosis of anxiety. So sometimes those are just things that are on the normal human emotions of spectrum of human emotions that we can manage with some of those things that you were talking about, like coloring and puppy time and, intentional gratitude. That's another thing that's there. But the kinds of anxiety that I see the most are generalized anxiety disorder. So that's just feeling anxious and you don't really know why. It's a complex interaction of your genes and environmental influences. And so sometimes it can be controlled and it's situational, and sometimes it's just not. You've got obsessive compulsive disorder. You've got separation anxiety, which we're seeing increasing after the pandemic. You have panic disorder, which can be from those panic attacks. Man, they look real and they look really, really scary. And it's where the faucet is turned on in your brain and you have this chemical cascade of anxiety. And a lot of times you don't know why. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, which can happen from a traumatic event that happened. And then something happens later on that triggers that. But these are all different shades of anxiety. But the main thing that I would want parents to know, they want to know, when should they go in? if these symptoms at home are impacting their daily activities, if they're having trouble going to church, thinking, or going to school, I don't know if I can go, and there's a lot of anxiety or symptoms or depression, not being able to get up out of bed, if they're not bathing, if they're not engaging in activities that they normally enjoy, those are all signs that, hey, this is past the threshold of what is just going to pass or what's just a bad day, and we really need to intervene early. That early intervention is so important because usually we can modify that with behavioral interventions, with prayer, with meditation, with intentional gratitude, with journaling, with things that are simple but not easy to do before it gets to the point where we're at a crisis, at a point of suicide, or at a point of, like you said, needing psychiatric help and medication. Early intervention is the best.
That is great advice. I want to look at that from the teen perspective as well. I asked one teenager who was in your session, told him, I said, I'm going to be interviewing her. What would you ask? I said, she said, how do you know? How do you know if it's just a moment where I've got to go suck it up or if it's time to just retreat?
Yeah, there was a girl who came up and asked me the same question. I don't know if it was the same girl or not, but she came up and asked me that afterwards. And we talked about one of the things that they see is the rise of mental health management that's happening on social media. So if you look at TikTok, actually, it's really scary because you have influencers who will give the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit disorder, for example, and say, this is exactly what you tell your healthcare provider so that you can get ADHD medications and that you can lose weight. Or this is, anxiety. And so they start to, be pulled into that. And if you start watching videos on anxiety, then you're going to be pulled into the algorithm. And all of a sudden you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have generalized anxiety disorder. So that's why it's so important. Again, I'll emphasize the importance of having that healthcare provider because there's a lot of information on the internet that looks really reputable and maybe even was from somebody who looks like they have credentials, but you just never know. And so again, how do you know when you're having anxiety or depression is if you cannot manage it, if it is overtaking every thought that you have, if it is changing the trajectory of your behavior, if you are making modifications. So here's how parents would know that. So if you're making modifications like, oh, I stay home from Sunday school because they don't like to go, so my husband goes with the other kids and then we go later. Or if you're having to sit on the sidelines with your kid, one of your kids who's not engaging the other activities, if you're making those behavioral and family modifications to accommodate anxious or depressed behavior, that's a sign that you need some help. Otherwise, you can have a bad day or a bad season, but even that, it's not a bad thing to get connection to some resources that are going to help you pull out of that.
Thank you for that. Tell us why you wrote your book and how it can help parents in their desire to help their teens cultivate a healthy thought life.
Well, I wrote the book again because I felt like God called me to do that during the pandemic. It was certainly nothing that I had anticipated or planned to do, but I felt like I looked back and I saw my own healing journey as a mom, as a woman, as a Christ follower, as a professor. And I had just arrived at Baylor, which is a faith based university. I've been at state schools before. So just had an opportunity to really be public about the way that I integrate faith into my health practice, because faith is just the core of everything that I do. And if you look at, and even nursing organizations, I mean, we recognize the impact of faith. And for me as a nurse practitioner, we are very holistic in our practice. We're much more comfortable in prescribing a puppy or some sunshine or a hug or more exercise than we are quick to go to medication and trying to manage everything from that medical model. So I really wanted to destigmatize healthcare. In the book, I go through 12 things that I see most often in pediatric practice, and that is mental health, social media, cyberbullying, vaping, substance abuse, divorce, gender identity, all of the things that are non-controversial and so easy to talk about, right? But each chapter goes through 3 doors: behind the clinic door, where I give you the health impacts; behind the home door, where I give you very practical home strategies and how to initiate conversation with your teen through what I call conversation keys; and then behind the heart door, because none of this is going to be possible. None of this self-help is going to be possible unless it is grounded in a spiritual identity and a spiritual health that you are cultivating in yourself. Once you do that, He will decrease your anxiety about parenting. He will give you so much more wisdom and confidence to parent. And so that's really what I hope that parents will get out of this book, is a Jumanji style parenting adventure that will give you hope for healthy relationships, no matter where you've come from, no matter the trauma that you've experienced, no matter your family dynamics or situation. There is hope for everyone. And in this world where we are overwhelmed with a constant barrage of bad news and fear-based parenting, I want to flip the narrative and have parents cultivate those healthy relationships.
One last question. What can the local church do to help foster, help bring awareness to this issue of mental health? We're in a smaller community, and possibly some of the larger churches that have more resources do this. But I don't see it being a norm where the local church partners with the mental health community and experts to help parents and teens get through these difficult times. What can the local church do?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me this, and I have so much to say about it. So, the first thing that I would say is that on my podcast, the Doctor Nurse Mama podcast, in my first series, I co hosted it with a pastor, my pastor, actually, Pastor Brian Haynes. And he talked about his own journey with mental health and how he struggled with that as a man, as a father, as a pastor, and how it has changed his trajectory to equip his church to respond to mental health. So there's a lot of conversation there, and you can go back and listen, especially to those first episodes where we really go in depth about that. But I would say, first of all, like you said, most churches are not big. Most people don't go to mega churches with those kind of resources. If you do, that's great, but that's not the norm. So the first thing that the local church can do is just decrease the stigma. We tend to over spiritualize mental health and make it just an issue of spiritual health, when there's a complex intersection of physical health and mental health and emotional health and spiritual health. Spiritual health is a big part of that, but it's not everything. So sometimes just sitting with people and just listening to them instead of giving them spiritual platitudes, like the devotion that I have in my book is that, one of the most misused verses in the Bible is be anxious for nothing. Like, oh, be anxious for nothing. Like, don't be anxious, period. But that's not what the verse says. The verse says, but in everything give thanks, and the peace of God transcends understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So it's not just stop being anxious, it's hey, replace your anxious thoughts with intentional thoughts of gratitude. God knows how to override that anxious process in our brain, but we have to do it. And so I think number one is just recognizing that mental health is complex and we don't have all of the answers. And the other thing that I think that the church needs to do is just walk alongside families who are struggling, create a safe space where they are welcome. And a lot of times parents are really afraid of the stigma that can happen because they have a crisis of faith, thinking, oh, my kid has anxiety. Obviously, they're having a faith crisis. If they would just pray more, read their Bible more, have more faith, it would go away. But just loving them where they are in that moment and just walking alongside them on that road to healing journey, I think is a really powerful start.
That's great. This has been so enlightening for me. Goodness, for me, it's so enlightening. Please tell our listeners where they can listen to your podcast and where they can purchase your book.
You can find the book anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Mardell, if you have one of those by you. But you can find me at drnursemama.com, drnursemama.com. That's where I'm going to use my professor brain, my hands-on nursing experience, and my heart as a mom to be a guide on the side for parents. So I'd love to have you listen to my podcast on American Family Radio, which has had I just have to say really quick, Amy, a shout out to them because the American Family Radio staff were asking me, how has your welcome been? And I said, I feel like I should walk in with a casserole and say, hey, y'all, I'm here. Like, that's what it feels like. It's been so great. So that response has been great. So I'd love to have you there on my website or social media.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peck. A wealth of information that I know that our listeners will absolutely take advantage of. God bless you. God bless your podcast, man, your book. And we're so excited for what God is doing through you and through your how he's using your voice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy, for letting me talk with your family today. I just so appreciate it.